Okay, great. Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for all the organizers of this workshop. This is always one of my favorite places to be. I try to talk and submit here as often as possible. I find this is a really great group of people coming from the data mining and machine learning and network science community all together. So I hope this continues. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about learning statistical models of network distributions. And you've already heard a couple of people already talk about these types of models. So Tammy talked about the beater models, and other posters I heard had mentioned some of these models as well. And just to motivate why we need these models, there's many types of analysis tasks that can be supported by having robust models of distribution of these data that we have, either graphs, networks with attributes on the nodes, on the edges, communities, so that we can have those distributions to, for example, test hypotheses we have about the data that we've observed, to simulate the behaviors of systems over time and how they might evolve, and to do causal inference or start to try to vary aspects of the system to understand really the types of underlying phenomena that are creating the kinds of characteristics that we see. So I'm going to tell you a story of some of the work that we've done in creating these models and how they intersect with a couple of these types of tasks. So the first one I'm going to talk about is hypothesis testing. And this is the primer that I give to people who haven't learned about what hypothesis testing is or have forgotten the steps that you would use. This is a very simple characterization of statistical hypothesis testing as it would be applied to networks. So first, what you would do is, if everything was ideal, you would observe one or more networks. You would calculate some statistics of interest from those networks. For example, how many triangles there are, what kind of communities, the size of the connected components, things like that. You would either have an analytical distribution over the space of possible graphs that you could see, or you would want to estimate the probability distribution over those graphs, and then from that distribution over the kinds of graphs that we're likely to see in this distribution, then you would determine an empirical or analytical sampling distribution for the values of that statistic that you would be likely to see from these graphs in the underlying distribution. Then if you have that distribution and the empirical sampling distribution of the statistic, then when you're given a new network and you want to decide, does it look like the things I've seen before? Is it significantly different? Is it an anomaly? Is it from the same class? These are all the kinds of tests that you can draw using these sampling distributions. So for example, you might say if the graph is unlikely to be drawn from a distribution, then it's an anomaly. Or if the statistic value you see is significantly different than, for example, what you'd expect under the null distribution, then you might assume that you have a significant effect in your data. So this is all fine and good. This is just how you would directly apply ideas from statistics. But the challenges that we have in the network space is that generally, let me go back. I can't go back. Try it again. So the challenges that we have are that we often only have one single large network available to sort of support this analysis as the foundation of this analysis. And if we only have a single large network, it's very difficult to determine the variability that we'd expect to see in that underlying distribution. And then to compound that, when we're trying to test various aspects of that distribution, the fact that a lot of the dependencies in the data that we have are very complex and sort of tightly connected in ways that we don't understand, it is difficult to isolate one dimension of the data and vary that or get rid of that and test other dimensions of the data by maintaining the distribution, because when we destroy one aspect of the distribution, one aspect of the data, the rest of the distribution falls apart. So for example, it may be hard to change the number of triangles in the underlying graph without changing the underlying community structure, just as an example. So one of the biggest problems in using this hypothesis testing framework for graphs is that we don't really understand well how to estimate this probability distribution over the space of possible graphs that we would see if we have only one large network or a small number of networks in order to estimate that distribution. But if for some reason we could learn a model of that underlying distribution of the graphs, and moreover we could efficiently sample from that distribution, then we could easily generate empirical sampling distributions in order to support these kinds of hypothesis tests. So that is something that we did. And so we have this framework that we call model-based hypothesis testing, where we used a specific type of model here called mixed Kronecker product models. But you can imagine using any other kind of graph model in this framework as long as that graph model produces samples from the distribution with sufficient variation. Okay, so here's what we would do. It just follows the framework that I mentioned before. We take an observed graph. We learn a model of the kinds of characteristics that we would see in that graph. In this case, a mixed Kronecker graph model, which I'll talk about in a few slides. But then we sample a set of graphs from that model. So we generate samples of that distribution. We then could, for example, calculate the likelihood of each of those samples that we observe. Then from those likelihoods, we can sort them and form an empirical sampling distribution, determine a critical value threshold, and then when we get a new graph, we could calculate its likelihood, look it up in this distribution, and either accept or reject based on what we've seen in the past. Okay? And so to illustrate how this might work in practice, here are some results that we have where we applied this to email networks that we have from Purdue. So we have, I can't see the date here because I'm getting old and I can't see on my slides, but I know it's about 190 email networks over the span of about a year, over a year, academic year a few years back at Purdue. And what we do is we categorize each of these networks as either being a network in the weekday where there's a lot more communication between the students and a weekend where there's fewer communications. And then what we did was learn a model from a representative single example of a weekday. And then we generated samples from this model, formed the empirical sampling distribution like I described. And then what we did was tested from that model all of the remaining networks, either a weekday network or a weekend network. And what we wanted the model to be able to do for us was correctly accept the null for all of the weekday networks. So we were hoping that the hypothesis test would say this new weekday network you've given me is no different than what I've seen before. And then for the weekend networks, we wanted the model to say, no, this is significantly different. And what I'm showing you here on this corner of the slide here is the set, it's all of these networks plotted with their clustering coefficient versus their geodesic distance. And you can see that there is some separation. So I think green are the weekends. And so they're spread more, there's a lot more variance in the types of statistics that we see in the networks. But they sort of surround and are laid on top of all of these weekday networks here. So it's not simple to just take a single statistic and separate the weekends from the weekdays. So when we applied the hypothesis testing, then we measured how many times did we correctly reject the null and correctly accept the null based on the weekend versus weekday idea. And I'm not going to tell you all the details of all of these models. I'll point you to this paper if you want to see more details. But the finding I want to point out here is that this first column here where it says false positives, this is how many times the model incorrectly rejected the null for a weekday and said, no, this looks significantly different than this weekday I learned the model from. And so we see these unacceptably high levels of false positives here, so that from a range of different models. So I won't go over the details of the models, but all of the models are essentially saying that all these networks look very different from each other, even though they were all email networks from Purdue with the same set of users, just different days. Okay? So why was that happening? So we expect from looking at these kinds of networks that we see over time that there is some natural variability in the kinds of structures that we would see. So sometimes the density is higher, sometimes it's lower. Sometimes you're going to see a few more triangles. One community is going to be more active than another. But that's going to, we assume that's going to be a relatively sort of random variation if at least you look at some period of time where there isn't a big evolution in the types of nodes in the network. So we expect, given our empirical evidence, that we would see some sort of distribution like this, where there's some points of the distribution that have higher likelihood and some points that have lower likelihood, but there is natural variability. If you look at the distributions that we produce from the models that we learn from an observed network, we repeatedly see distributions that look more like this. So most of the models place the probability mass over a small set of nearly isomorphic graphs. And so what that means, so hopefully the graph that you learn the model from is here inside that peaked distribution. But what that means is it's very likely for the distribution to say, all of my graphs in this distribution are going to look exactly like this graph that I learned it from, and anything else with any sort of variation looks entirely different. It looks like it has no probability of being drawn from that distribution. And the reason for this mismatch between what the models we use, and so I should say these are lots of different kinds of models, exponential random graph models, Chung-Liu models, Kronecker models, I could go on and on. Stochastic block models, I'll keep going on. Right? So it happens with a lot of the different models, and what that seems to be primarily due to is that we use an edge-based likelihood structure to generate networks from these underlying distributions, and the edges correspond to a lot of different Bernoulli flips of coins. And so when you flip for every possible edge that's there in the network, and then you have 100 million of them, there's a lot of concentration, and you get very little variability across the overall structure of the graph. So to fix this problem, I should go back a second, but the animations probably won't work. So let me say, before I say how to fix the problem, the reason we have produced a lot of methods that use this edge-based way of generating the networks is that makes it really simple to generate samples from the underlying distribution and really efficient methods for generating those networks. So that's the reason that most of the research in this area have focused on these kinds of methods. So we don't want to just throw out these models and say edge-based methods are not going to work. So we want to figure out how to have more variability incorporated into the model structure. So the way that we do this is actually introducing dependencies into these coin flips that we use to decide each edge whether it should be there in the model or not. Okay, so for those of you who don't know about edge-based generative models, maybe seeing Tammy's talk will give you more of a introduction, but here is a quick introduction of what Kronecker product graph models look like. And so what they start off with is a small set of parameters that are used to seed the process of generating the network. And so here I have a 2x2 set of parameters. And if we look at those as colors to represent the probabilities that are in each of those parameters, the way that we produce a graph is we take a Kronecker product of this small seed probability matrix with itself to repeatedly until we get a large matrix of probabilities, the size of the network that we want to generate. So what this looks like, this should work like that. So we do the Kronecker product repeatedly to get this large matrix, and so you can see there ends up being this fractal structure in the values of the probabilities that end up in each cell of this matrix. So this is an n by n matrix when we want to produce a graph with n nodes. And then to sample a network from this underlying model, what we'll do is just go and flip each of those Bernoullis independently, and when we get a heads, we put an edge in the graph, otherwise we don't, right? And so what we're going to do is take this process. So there's a lot of benefits to this Kronecker model process that Yuri Leskovic and colleagues have sort of studied over time. But what we're going to do with this is we're going to introduce edge dependencies in that Bernoulli process to ensure that we capture the variation that we see in the real world. So that's what our mixed Kronecker product graph model does. So we can fully tie, I guess to say this quickly, So instead of doing all those Kronecker products with the probabilities and then sampling each of the Bernoullis at the end of the process, what we can do is sample the Bernoullis at the beginning and take the Kronecker product of the edge matrix with itself over time to then produce a sample from that underlying distribution in the same way. So what we're going to do is, instead of waiting until the end to do that sampling process, we're going to do it along the way. So what we do here is this shows you a small part of the Kronecker product matrix, right? So we've only done the Kronecker product 3 times here, and we get this matrix. So then we sample from that before we do the next Kronecker product. So now we take the seed parameter matrix, do the Kronecker product with that matrix of zeros and ones. The black and white are zeros and ones. And so you can see now here we get a structure of the intermediate matrix where some of it is all white, right? It's all been zeroed out. You can't possibly get edges there. And then we do the Kronecker, then we sample from that before doing the next Kronecker product. And so the reason it's called a mixed Kronecker product is that we don't fully tie it. We only tie it after that first 3 iterations. And depending on where you do that level of tying, that affects how much variation you get in the underlying graphs. So here is the last result. So we flip from this. And what you can see is that, well, maybe you can't see this from the matrix, but what we can show you theoretically is that each edge exists with the same probability and expectation in this mixed model versus the underlying Kronecker model. But what we get is variation overall in the distribution that we see of the samples of the graphs overall. And so what we've shown is that this model can capture effectively the variability that we see in these natural populations of networks. The fact that we're tying things together produces better graphs overall with more clustering and more variability, but that makes it harder to estimate the parameters of the model. But a few years ago at KDD, we had a paper where we showed we could use stochastic method of moments in order to sample, to learn the parameters of these models. I won't go into the details of that either. But this is the model that now we used for the hypothesis testing that I showed you at the beginning. So we currently use this model because it captures the variability in the underlying networks better than other models that we've seen up until this point. But if you, for example, come up with another graph model that you think captures the underlying distribution better, you could use it in the same type of hypothesis testing framework. Okay, so that was the first part of the talk. And that was only for, we spent a number of years investigating this, but only for networks that were simple networks. They're just nodes and edges. There were no attributes on attribute values on the nodes or on the edges. And ultimately, I'm a relational learning person. I want to learn models of how to predict attribute values on nodes in the network. And so really, I wanted to be able to not only sample network structures, but sample network structures with correlated attributes, which is what we see in the real world. So how can we generate attributed network samples from an underlying distribution where the structure is varying and the attributes have correlation amongst themselves as well? So what we're doing now is moving from this not simple, but what I'm presenting you as a one-dimensional distribution here of these all possible graphs in the space that we're trying to model. And now what I want to do is make that even more difficult and say, what if we made the other dimension attributes that are on each of the nodes, and then we model the full joint distribution of both attribute values and structure in the network. And so here I've shown you very simple samples of attributes, which could be a class label, plus or minus, so let's say political views on the users in Facebook, whether or not they're liberal or Democrats, or who they're going to vote for, right? So some simple binary attribute here on the nodes. And then now what we have is some complicated joint distribution of attributes and graph structure. And I'm just showing you some joint distribution I pulled off of Google and stole this image. This is not actually a visualization of this joint distribution because the dimensionality of this joint distribution is so high that I can't even really, visualize it for you. But imagine that one point somewhere in this distribution is a large graph with attributes. Let's see if I can go back. One point here is a large graph with attributes on all of the nodes. Okay, so the big question is then how to learn and effectively sample from this super large exponential distribution here of graph space and attribute space at the same time. So there's been some work in the past in both the machine learning community and the network science community on actually coming up with models of this full joint distribution. I think Lisa Couture is the first one to come up with this kind of model with her PRMs. And recently, I guess, in the space of exponential random graph models, there have been people that have included attributes in that space so that it's also a joint distribution. And Yuri Leskovic has also come up with this multiplicative attributed graph model recently. So all of these models are really producing joint distributions of graphs with attributes. But these methods were primarily developed as descriptive models of the correlation structure in the underlying networks. And so it's difficult to use them to effectively and efficiently sample from the underlying distribution for a number of reasons that I don't have time to get into, but I'm happy to talk to you about it offline. But our key finding, or our key insight, was that in order to sample effectively from this full joint distribution, we could really exploit these recent advances in edge-based generative models of network structure to approximate sampling from this really complicated joint distribution. So what we're going to do is use the generative graph models, so all of the work that's gone on in the network science community to produce these good models that can produce likely structures of graphs that we would see. And what we're going to do is use them in an accept-reject sampling framework to put attributes in there as well. And so what that looks like is that we have this space of attributed graphs, right, as this really large space that we can't possibly model effectively. But inside that is only a relatively small slice of things that are going to be likely graph structures. And then inside of that, there's some small region of graphs with attributes that are likely to happen. So what we're going to use is the generative graph models to get us a sample from inside this red circle, and then we can accept or reject to get ourselves inside that green circle, and we can effectively ignore everything in the blue space and come up with a more effective sampling procedure. So here's the example of what accept-reject sampling looks like for those of you who don't know. That's just a general process, again, from statistics, where we want to sample from some complicated target distribution, but it's hard to generate things from inside that distribution, although we can calculate the likelihood of those things inside that distribution. And we can sample effectively from this simpler distribution that's kind of close. It gives you things that are nearly what you want, and then you can just calculate the differences in the two likelihoods. So here, if I sampled something from this point where it's a vertical line, I would reject it all of the time, this red amount of time, so that I end up only with enough samples that correspond to the likelihood of the distribution that I have. So we'll end up spending more time generating samples, and then we'll reject some of them. Okay, so we'll get this green distribution overall. So what does the method look like? What we do is we sample attributes for the nodes first. Then we use the graph model to propose edges to go in the model. Those edges are going to have associated nodes with attributes. And then we'll decide to whether or not we accept that sample for the node conditioned on the attributes of the, did I say node? Well, you'll see the process in a second. So we're going to do conditional acceptance. So what it looks like here, so here I'm using E for the graph for edges. So we want this joint distribution of X and E, and we're going to sample the attributes first, and then we're going to sample the edges conditioned on the attributes. And so if we have a graph here that has edges and it has colors according to some attribute, we're going to then separate those two. We're going to learn a graph model and an attribute model. And then we'll generate attributes on nodes from the attribute model, and then we'll generate edges from this network model and accept or reject them based on some probability that they should be accepted, right? So where do those acceptance probabilities come from? What we're going to do is generate data naively as if we're assuming independence between the attribute model and the network model, and then we can calculate how often you see every type of combination and then the ratio of what we expected to see in the original data and what we see in this naive approach that assumes independence. The difference between those two will be your accept-reject ratios. Okay, so here what you can see is that in the original data, there's the green bars show you the combinations. So here I'm representing a binary variable like political views as 0, 0 on the two nodes, 1, 1, and 0, 1, right? So they're either mismatched or they're matched on 1 or they're matched on 0. And so what you can see is when we naively sample assuming independence, we get far too few 1, 1s and far too many 0, 1s. And so then the acceptance probabilities reflect that. So when we do we put this all together in a framework. We have what's called the attributed graph model, which was published in WWW a couple years back. And so the method looks like this. We learn the parameters from of both the attribute model and the graph model from the data that we have. And then basically you can think of it as a filtered sampling process that uses these accept-reject ratios. So here this shows you, so my student likes to think of this as a probabilistic filter. So let's say we're at some point in the sampling process where we have this set of edges and these attributes on the nodes. What we're going to do is use the graph model to propose a new edge. We're going to look up the attribute values of the two nodes incident to that edge. We're going to go up here and index into these probabilities. We're going to flip a coin with that probability, and in this case we'll reject that edge because it had the 0, 1 combination, and then we're going to generate a new edge, and in this case it's a 1, 1, so it has higher probability of being accepted, so it's added to the graph. And so what we're doing in this process is we're exploiting the process of this edge-based generative model. Because we're flipping all these Bernoullis, we can just attach a process on top of that in order to get our attributes with the right kind of correlation that we'd expect. So here are some empirical results where I should say that this process works with any kind of edge-based generative model. So in this case, in our analysis, we used Kronecker models. I can't see the letters, so I'm trying to remember here. Kronecker models, transitive Chung-Lu models, and I guess Kronecker models with two sizes of seed matrices at the beginning. And so this shows you now the graph structure that we get when we layer this accept-reject process on top of that underlying model. And the takeaway that you should have from these plots is that we basically achieve the same exact graph characteristics that the underlying model had before. So this process is only as good as the graph model that you give it, right? So if the Kronecker model is going to produce particular kinds of edge structures, we will get those edge structures from this accept-reject process. And so we preserve the characteristics of the model that you use, and then, but what we get instead, or in addition to that, is we get the kind of correlation that we expect to see based on the data that we use to learn it from. So here what this is showing you is with a whole bunch of different kinds of models. This is correlation of political views attribute, and so we see in the observed data correlation of about 0.2, and here's the correlation that we produce in our samples with all of the graph models. But if you don't use our process, here's the correlation you get just by random chance. So you get nothing. Right? So if you just naively tried to put things together, you wouldn't get any correlation that matched what you'd have in the real data. And now with this accept-reject process, we can. And I should point out that those pink lines here in the structure are, we compared to the MAG model at this point, which was the best thing to possibly use for this kind of modeling of the joint distribution. And because of the structure of the model, it doesn't produce graphs with reasonable characteristics. So this process does much better. So the key finding here is that these statistical models of graphs that use this edge-based generation to efficiently produce samples can be used to now sample from this full joint and get us networks that also have correlated attributes. And in principle, this process would work with any kind of edge-based generative model of graphs. So then you might naturally ask, what if you take work from one of my students and put it together with the other student and say, will it work for mixed Kronecker product graph models? And the answer is no. Because mixed Kronecker product graph models have a hierarchical structure to how they're being generated. So there's more dependence between the latent variables. So you could use it, but what happens is that the chance of things being rejected is very, very high. And so you actually don't end up accepting anything that's useful. So the key component of the AGM framework using accept-reject sampling is that it's only going to work if your proposal distribution is close to the target that you have and that there's actually a reasonable number of things that you'll accept when you do that sampling process. Because of the structure of hierarchical network models, which also applies to the beater models as well as MKPGMs, they specifically have started to use hierarchies in this models of generating the networks in order to produce more complicated structures that match what we see in the real world. And when we use these hierarchies, what that does is it tends to push the mass into regions of the space that makes things not spread evenly or mostly evenly across all the possible edges. And what we needed for our sampling process is that if we're going to just sample attribute values for each of the nodes, then we need there to be a lot of times where we happen to put attribute values on an edge that's likely to get sampled. If you look at what happens here in the MKPGM, there's a large part of that matrix that's zeroed out, right? Everything that's white has no chance of ever being sampled. And so that means where we put the attribute values in order to be able to accept samples has to not happen randomly through that network. So we have a little bit more theory to talk about exactly what the structure of the model needs to have in order for the AGM process to work well. But I won't go into the details here, and I will point you to my student Pablo, who's here somewhere, yeah, back there behind the column. His new solution he will be talking about tomorrow in this room in the social network setting on using constrained sampling of attributed graphs to solve this problem. And really what we did was took the structure of the hierarchy of the sampling from MKPGMs, and this would also apply to beaters as well, and put it into the same type of approximate sampling framework, but one that takes into account more of the hierarchical structure, so that what would happen is that we can go back and revisit things that happened earlier in the hierarchy if we can't sample effectively down below. And so I won't give you any more details than that. I'll say come to the poster tonight or go to his talk tomorrow, but this is what the structure of that method looks like. So now I'll just end with saying if we did have this method where we could generate network samples with the right kinds of structure and the right kinds of correlation in the attributes, what can that be used for? Well, one of the things it can be used for, and this is why I designed it, was to study the robustness and the characteristics of the machine learning methods that we layer on top of these networks. So often what happens in the machine learning community is someone comes up with a new collective inference algorithm or some other kind of learning algorithm, and then we apply it on some set of graphs that the researcher happens to have, and then we say, oh, look, it improves accuracy, and that's great. We move on, but it's hard to really understand which methods are going to work well in which situations, and when you've learned it on one kind of graph, is it going to work well in another kind of graph? In order to start making those decisions, we need to have better control over generating graphs with variability in their characteristics. So these models that, that we produce with the CSAG method, what we've started using these for, and this is what Giselle Zeno talked about earlier today and at her poster over lunch, was to use these to simulate semi-synthetic data sets that have characteristics that are close to what we observe in a real-world scenario, but where we vary some of the dimensions of the data. And so what that looks like is now that we have an observed graph here that has not just the structure, but also some attributes associated with it. We're going to learn the CSAG model, and then what we're going to do once we've learned the model and we have the parameters in that graph model, we can change those parameters a little bit to change and vary the kinds of graph structures that we'd see in the model. So what that does is the first learning process gets us to a point in space that's useful based on the networks that we see, and then we have a knob to turn to sort of move us a little bit around in that space and to see what happens to our methods as we move around in that space. So what Giselle has done so far is varied things like density and attribute correlation in a space close to the real networks that we see, and then she generates a whole bunch of different graphs. And then we apply our machine learning methods to those, and then we can produce these kinds of plots that she showed where, for example, now we have over varying levels of density, still all very sparse, which is what we see in the real world, but still varying types of densities that we see, and the amount of correlation in the attributes. What kinds of performance do we see with all of our methods? And so you should find her and see. I guess her poster's not on the wall anymore, but you can talk to her more, look at the paper for more of these kinds of plots. It's very interesting to start to compare the different methods that we have over a wider space of graphs. Okay, so to wrap up, let me just talk a little bit about why I think this process works and how it might be used in other kinds of modeling techniques that we have in the space of graphs. Really, I think that this edge-based approach to generating networks makes it very easy to produce networks and think about how they might be produced, because it's just the likelihood of each edge being there or not. But if you start thinking about attributes on top of that, if you just think of it as a full joint distribution and the likelihood over that space, it's easy to talk about and think about, but a huge part of that space has essentially no probability of ever occurring. So we have chosen representations and objective functions that match more easily to how we think as computer scientists we might produce data under a certain distribution, but it doesn't necessarily match up well with what tasks that we have in the real world and how the types of things that we actually want to evaluate. So there's two types of approaches to deal with this. First, you could make a representation that's much more problem specific and tailor an objective function to the very types of things that you would say want to evaluate. So for example, instead of considering our joint distribution as all possible graphs that could occur between a set of nodes, which includes the empty graph, it includes the complete graph, and lots of things in between that we're not expecting to ever see. So you could come up with something much more constrained and specific that sort of filters out all those things. Or you could use the language that we have to describe something much more generally than we expect to use, and use constraints in that space to really hone our analysis to the region of the space that we are likely to see the types of things that we want to analyze. And so I think of this as using constraints and inductive bias to target our distribution to something that's a better fit to what we want to model in the real world. And so I think that kind of idea could be applied to other parts of the space of network learning. And then just to finish up, to tease you to the things that we're working on now, we're really using these CSAG method and the simulations to start to study the transferability of graph models that we learn on one part of the network to really assess whether that learned model is going to be applicable to another part of the network where the structure might be slightly different than what we learned it from. And really trying to quantify whether it's still this new network is drawn from the same distribution, or if it is drawn from a slightly different distribution, how can we tweak the model to reflect that new distribution? So that's it. Thank you very much.
So do these generative models have the property that if you change just a few edges of your graph, the resulting graph also has a high probability under this generative model?
Depends on which ones you're talking about. If you're talking about the ones that I was saying place most of the probability mass on just a small number of networks, I don't know what the threshold is at which they'll say it's drawn from a different distribution. I don't think a few edges will do it because we have very large graphs with millions of edges, but very quickly it will think that it's drawn from a different distribution. Tanya, be nice.
So the joint distribution is really geared towards label inference, right? So you're
Yeah.
looking, yeah. So how does this translate or apply or generalize to other tasks on graphs? Let's say prediction, or if you have repeated sort of labels that are different under different sort of parameters, but from the same network, under implicit network, how do, like?
Well, you can think of the joint distribution more generally. So even though we started with just a single attribute, so I guess we've done 2 binary attributes jointly in the network, just because that was a simpler scenario to start with. You can use this process to generate any number of attributes on the node with any dimensionality. And you could have it generate attributes on the edges as well. But the more complicated you make it, the harder this approximate sampling is going to be to effectively get samples from that distribution. So as the, I guess right now we're in a space where we've done a lot more work on the correlation and the particular complex structures that we've seen in the network, and we're sort of making baby steps into having attribute values sort of in there. You could imagine going to much more complicated attribute structures, but then you probably would not be able to generate as complicated graph structures. So it's really, we just really need to move into those directions in order to produce those kinds of graphs. But even though I'm interested in using the samples from the distribution to evaluate, say, collective inference methods that just are doing label propagation through the network, that doesn't mean that these samples can't be used for more complicated analytic tasks. So you could compare non-collective to collective inference. You could do any sorts of hypothesis testing. If you have a new network with different kinds of attributes, you could decide, is it drawn from the same distribution? So it's really sort of wide open to the kinds of tasks that you'd have. I would say the one thing that we really haven't done yet is to think about how they change over time, and to really think of it, the distribution, as being a temporal process. And so I leave it to you to do that part of the work.
The speaker.
Okay.
And